do a composite, what you put into it. And I certainly have seen districts where everything and the kitchen sink is put into it. And then people don't know what to do with it. An additional consideration, though, is that data systems have gotten very, very much more in depth in the last 10 years, and much more is possible easily than was 10 years ago. So I'm going to stop talking and hope some of you will jump in with your thoughts.
So I like this idea of, oh sure,
Yeah.
I like the idea of trying to prioritize. I think that's really important, so the composite does get at that. One concern I have is that we then detract, or we encourage detraction from the root cause analysis, because when people see urgency, then they want to jump in immediately, and so we go right into intervention or action, and we forget the analysis. So because it requires an extra step, they still have to unpack the composite to figure out the problem, and so we're making it harder for them in some ways to do that, and time is essential.
Yeah, I do want to say that the way that we've been talking about using that for teams to actually use that composite indicator would be looking at the kids who have most recently had a large jump, perhaps, in that number, in that composite indicator number, or kids who are not so far off track, because those are the kids that are hardest to get back on track, right? So they're really at a high probability of dropping out. Those are actually the kids that we have been saying, maybe there's other systems that within the school that are helping reconnect them and things like that, but where an early warning system really has a lot of its power is actually where we can use it to catch those kids as they first start to fall off track, right? So using that composite indicator to just kind of like, okay, we're going to focus on these kids, and then, I mean, that's a conversation though, obviously for the school teams to have, would be which kids do we want to focus on. I think the kids who are really far off track, people generally know that those kids are really far off track, and so the early warning system doesn't have as much value added for identifying those particular kids.
Hey, Sarah, this is William from MDRC. I mean, I think the thing that matters most is if the composite improves the predictability of sort of the kids that are at risk, then it's, then it's high value. And then if you combine it with the specs framework that's emphasizing the analysis side to reinforce, right, that you have to pay attention to then that next step of seeing what's underneath it, then it's great. Like if the composite works better than the individual indicator to help me identify the kids most at risk or on some continuum of risk, then great, like terrific, as long as it's feasible for the schools or districts to execute whatever needs to be executed to generate that score. I think that's great.
Okay. Yeah, and I think the districts that I've talked to that are in Montana that are using both the composite and the individual is I just totally lost. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to come back to because if they were just looking at the kids who had the attendance, and then they looked at all the kids who had the behavior flag, and looked at all the kids that had the course performance flag, and then looked at all the kids who had both attendance and behavior, and the kids who had attendance and course performance. It's like, which group of kids do we focus on if we're having a small group meeting with a team to actually try to identify what interventions there might be? The other thing about this is that, and so here's where I'm gonna like scroll down a little bit on screen, is that there is a confusion sometimes in districts that we've noticed, getting confused with like the multi-tiered systems of support. Just we think that they should be within this and this framework so that we can, I'm gonna have to go a little bit smaller here, guys. So that you still have like this kind of looking at the school-wide systems and how many kids we're flagging. Sorry. Looking at the school-wide system and like looking at the data holistically across the whole entire school and seeing where everybody's struggling, and so that can help you actually build up these universal supports like in your tiered system. But then also being able to, like, this just kind of gives people a little bit more to to look at, because I think there is some confusion of like, just because a kid is a yellow kid, that doesn't necessarily mean that they need a small group strategy. And so I think that that's another piece that we need to like clarify a little bit for everyone, is that your thresholds for your indicators, whether you're going composite or individual or both, your thresholds for your indicators are not necessarily the same thing as these tiered systems, where we're looking at school-wide, small versus targeted. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So I think
Jenny, loud.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so I think one of the concerns I always have with like composite versus individual indicators is that the composite indicators will actually situate whatever's going on within the student. And so it's easy to kind of sometimes lose track of the patterns. Like if you have an issue with gender gaps in your school, that may or may not emerge through the composite measurement. It's just sort of aggregated that way, but you sort of know, you just kind of know what you kind of already know. But there could be things where there are patterns where it's really just your first period classes that students are failing a lot of, or something like that. And that will just like come out in a composite measure. So I don't think it's like, it's not like you can't do that when you have a composite measure, but it does sort of start to really make you think about what are the risk factors that this kid has and what's happening with an individual student, as opposed to taking a step back sometimes and trying to understand what are things that are about an individual student's situation versus things that are happening on a more global level within their school.
Right, which is why you want to look at the building level stuff first.
Right.
Then look down at the individual children.
Right.
Right.
So Ginny, do you think that that would still be true if you had both of them, if you had the composite indicator for like the group? Like, and so again, this is talking about like an individual's student team. So if you had the composite that was just like, these are the 10 kids that we're going to talk about in the next hour and a half. And then also having the individual indicators so that you could actually kind of get into that root cause analysis. Do you think that would be okay?
So I don't think you can't do it, but I can sort of see where you grab like the 10 kids who are within a particular range, but it's actually like 30 kids who are in that, and you may not notice it because within that 10 kids, they may not be that same pattern happening. And so it's not like you can't do it, but I think it's something that you start to think about the risk of dropping out as being about a kid phenomenon, as opposed to actually taking a bigger picture and sort of saying, what is it that our school may be doing that is contributing to this, and then going into what is needed for individual students or groups of students.
Sarah, just to clarify, we've been having kind of a running conversation back and forth about the extent to which we're looking at individual interventions, responses, actions, and the extent to which we're also looking at patterns in the school and across the building. And really, I think that conversation has come down to both situations where the intervention may happen initially at the individual level, but the school-wide intervention or grade-wide intervention may be. So that's been the theme.
So one thought I have, Bob, is that I can almost see the utility of the composite in combination with the individual coming more into play on the post-secondary readiness side as opposed to the high school graduation side. So on the high school graduation side, the challenge is that being low at any of those things is a problem in itself. Even if it ranks you lower in some index, like if you're missing a month of school, you're constantly getting in trouble. If you're failing classes, like none of that leads to a good result. Even if you might have a slightly greater chance to, on your own bootstraps, recover somehow from some position than another, right? So I'm not sure what's gained. I think you still have to figure out how we're going to help all those kids in the most efficient way with the resources we have. But I think on the college readiness, we may not be there yet with enough data is the problem to it. So maybe it's a thing to work, is that's what we're running on this thing of like, okay, so our things are like 97% attendance and a B average, and once you're identified, some good like social emotional skills. And there I think we are a little bit saying like, in what combination do you just monitor, and what combination do you have to do something? And potentially there's many more kids in that area than in the other area, right? So even this thing of like, too many kids to respond to even with massive resources, right, potentially, and actually not needing to respond to, like, I think puts greater weight in having a more powerful predictive analytic composite that would give us guidance to say, it's this combination that's more problematic than that. Now, my only caveat with that is I think there's an allure there. I bet some of that, when you do the analysis, is partially driven by some policies that are in place that make one thing more important than another in a place and time. And if that policy changes after you've done your algorithm, like, the algorithm might not be accurate. Like, that's like, there's gonna be a need to keep updating the algorithm, which is another burden put on somebody. So, I mean, there's complexities there, but it seems like maybe it's in that area that benefit of knowing who gives us greater benefits versus the cost than like on the high school graduation side. I don't know.
And there's gotta be the understanding that you have to update that algorithm when you change policies and
Right.
procedures and other things that
Yeah.
You can automate that.
Can you hear that?
Yeah.
Machine learning.
Can you guys
Yeah.
speak up as you guys are responding to Bob? Sorry, just.
Yeah, so, I mean, you can automate the algorithm development through machine learning. So we're starting to experiment with that, not in some of our education work, but some of our other work, where you can build in the system so that as stuff changes, it'll continue to update itself to keep the predictive power sort of up to date with other things that are happening over time.
if it's all in the system.
Right.
And just, I appreciate both of those. Oh, if you guys want to keep talking, that's fine. I have a question afterwards.
I just want some clarification.
Yeah.
Curious of the thought you just shared.
Right.
Is, would a composite sort of be a replacement for the college?
No,
student?
it would just
Or
be,
in addition?
it'd be a piece of guidance to help figure out. As we were saying yesterday, like, if you look at those indicators,
Yeah.
and you have a bunch of kids at 93% attendance, and you have some kids that are like 2.9, and you have some kids that are like, when do you monitor, when do you react? It's like, right now, it's sort of a field question, right? Because
Yeah.
we don't know enough. I'm saying if we had enough data, and you got some guidance that say, these combinations are more problematic than this, these kids who actually need to do something with now, these kids, like, if we could get some help with that, because potentially there's like more kids in that bucket, right, than there are in the on track to graduate high school bucket. So that's where maybe that utility of like getting us a better, helping us narrow our focus a little bit might have more utility and offset some of the costs. I mean, there's still costs, but it's like, it's worth it because on the other side, there's costs to not having it.
I mean, I think Sarah, if the data team recommendation is sort of a both and, I think that works, and people should, I think districts and states or whomever should have an opportunity to see what how a composite works against individual indicators, and in practice may learn that the practicalities are better or worse, and whether it's the system level, sort of bigger picture stuff, or whether it's the individual student level. And to Bob's point, at high school versus post-secondary.
Yeah.
This may also get into the question, and it may later on this there's discussion. In some of the big rural states, the state is the one that develops the early warning system, basically. The small districts don't have that capacity in many districts. And the state does not have access to some of the data that in a bigger district or a smaller district would be immediately accessible. You begin to get into strong philosophies of local control and what is the state allowed to see. And the answer in some states is very little. And that would be the local inclination. And the state's not doing the environment. So it becomes, who's developing the system and where does the information reside once it's been collected? And that becomes an issue. It's clearly solvable. I think there are some states where the information does go up, it gets processed, it comes back, and the state never really sees it. It's machines see it, but there are those fears.
Yeah, and that's kind of around the advice solution in some of the states that are looking at that. Because that does allow the districts to have the local control over the data. It doesn't actually get stored at the state level. One other question I have for you guys, just as everybody's in the room, is have you guys talked about how you do suggest that a team identifies the kids, like, okay, so yes, there needs to be like a systems look at the data and being able to analyze that to see where there's these trends and that we can help address at like that universal level. But also, we are still talking about individual students sometimes, right? So there's still a team that's going to be talking about the individual students. My question is, how do you identify the kids that group is going to talk about when there's a small capacity? It's like one team that meets once a week. Where do you see? Other thoughts? Other questions? Okay. So the next recommendation is really, it kind of gets into what you guys were talking about with those different views of the data, looking at it system-wide versus looking at it at that student level. And so one of our recommendations is also to develop these kinds of data displays for the different user groups. So if you're a superintendent, for example, you're going to maybe want to look at that holistic trend data of how students across the building are doing in attendance, behavior, course performance, all the indicators. Whereas like a student team that's going to be identifying the students, they actually need kind of a different view. And so that was another one of our recommendations. Any other thoughts on that?
Will there be any, this is Katie from Kentucky, all of our schools use the same data system now. Will there be any assessment of what districts already use and how it might integrate? How they might have to change what they're doing to make this work?
How, if a system already has, or if the school district or state, like Kentucky, already has a system in place, is there any sort of discussion about how this would integrate in with that? Or evaluate, is that right? What is already
Is there
in
a way
place?
to
Or is there a way
evaluate
for
or
it to-
determine what systems will integrate with what is being
What
proposed?
systems will already, yeah, what will or will not, I guess, integrate with what the recommendation.
So the schools if states are very interested in this model. Is it going to be a heavy lift or not?
If the states are interested, will it be a heavy lift or not? And what are the costs?
Yeah, I think, I think if a state wants to do this, like, I think that what we would like to do is provide the recommendations, and I think our group as a whole is gonna have to decide what to do with those recommendations after we come up with them. Like, is there a national need right now to have something that's actually validating the indicators in the back piece, like through an Ed 5 program or something like that, but then also provides this platform that tracks the indicators as well as the interventions that kids are getting. Like, I don't know what all of that looks like. I think we're still trying to, like, what ideally would that piece together look like? And then after we have that view based on everybody's points of view, which by May we will definitely have it, and we're fleshing it out like next week when everybody's coming here for the data display group. But I think we need all of those pieces to know what are our solid recommendations around this, and then I think one of the next pieces is actually, do we actually really build the tools to do this? Because I think that's a real possibility. But I don't know, I can't talk to the cost necessarily at this point.
So this is Vincent. I'm just going to punctuate. I think this is actually one of the most important of the recommendations in some respects, because I think of our team, and there's always at least three tensions. One tension is just data you have to see in order to monitor the system. The other tension is data you need to see to implement a business process, a standard work process. And then I think the third tension is kind of what we've been talking about here, the data you need to see in order to start a root cause analysis. And so I think the displays here can actually be a really important entry into all three of those conversations. So I'm just affirming that I think this recommendation has a lot of potential to help organizations orient folks in a way that can be very meaningful and allow them to take action appropriately. So the monitoring question versus the intervention question versus the root cause analysis question, I think there's a lot of potential here through the display of data.
Yeah, and I think part of that is actually what's on the screen right now, is how do we actually write in the scope creep of this by adding too much information that just completely overloads. Like, and again, that might get into how do we prioritize which students we're talking about, right? And then what data do you actually need kind of, these systems need to be dynamic like that so that you can actually drill down when needed and then actually come back up and see overall trends or of the particular student and of the school. But yeah, having that ability to go in and out, zoom in and out is really important. One of the other things that we had talked about was just making sure that the number of indicators should be limited, just so there's not completely, we don't want 16 different indicators because then it's like, okay, which indicator are we actually focusing on? Again, as a school team, or as a student, as a team focused on the students, that can get really hard to identify which kids we're actually talking about. Another thing that we wanted to make sure that these kind of district-wide reports did, so again, this is all under the recommendation of having different reports and different access to data based on who you are and what focus you're looking at right now. But another one is to, at the district level at least, or school level, is to make sure that you're aligning those outcomes with other outcomes that you're prioritizing in the school. So that you're using existing methods to collect the data, that you're aligning that then with the priorities of like, okay, if we're having an attendance focus in our school, like that's a huge thing up here in Oregon and other places too. If we're actually saying in our school priorities that this is what we're going to be focusing on, making sure that those are aligned with the early warning system. And just that communication, because that actually kind of gets into this recommendation 5 about how we actually disseminate these reports. And we want to make sure that there's some considerations of professional development around looking at disaggregated data so that we don't just start pointing fingers at the kids and being like, okay, well, that's that group of kids, obviously they're having problems. Like, that's not the way that we want to be talking about. That's not a solution to helping kids. So, any thoughts on that? I know we only have like about 10 minutes, so. Another piece is this looking at making sure that we have champions within the district, making sure that we're not selling the reports versus actually creating like a collaborative process to build the reports, because I think that's another thing that we talked a lot about in our group is once you start to have somebody that's gathering this data and now you have a team that's looking at data, like people can get sidetracked really easily. So, or you know, they're like, well, we're actually already doing this over here in our group, and we're doing this already over here, and so there's like this kind of interagency fighting over grounds, and so we want to make sure that we're being inclusive of all the different people who might be needing data, at least so that we don't create competing initiatives within the school or district. Ground the data in individual stories to make them compelling is another recommendation. And design these systems that take big unchangeable factors into account, for example, like teacher turnover. We also would need to be able, I think somebody else was talking about policy things, so we need to be able to think about the things that might be changing over time that might make the indicators different. And then the 6th recommendation is looking at creating a well-balanced team and securing that funding to actually support the initiative. So, like I was talking about earlier, we've had some districts that, you know, that first year maybe they're just using national recommendations on the thresholds and indicators, but then they actually go to the school board and they get approval to actually have a data scientist or somebody come in and actually build a system specifically for them. And so we just want to make sure that that's in people's minds. I think somebody brought up costs with the state level, but I think also at the district and school level, I have this question all the time of like, well, should I go with a vendor and how much would that cost? Or should I have somebody, like a whole FTE here at my school or my district? And how much, you know, how much is this going to cost me at the end of the day? So I think we need to be considering some of that and making sure that we are providing solutions that maybe can be automated so that there's not as big of a cost on the districts. We'll see where that one goes. But on these teams, we want to definitely make sure that we have a mix of technical people who build the system, but then also those policy level people that are going to be able to help align that work really well. A lot of the folks in my group have worked really closely with districts over time in building these systems, and one of the things that they found is that you know, one administrator will be like, okay, yes, this is what we want to do, and then they get kind of pulled in another direction by a different administrator. And so, again, that interagency conflict, we want to try to minimize that as much as possible. So creating this team where everybody's kind of around the table at the very beginning to make sure that their voice is heard, and that also creates the buy-in for the system if you feel like your voice is being heard.
Sarah, if I could add, this is Amy, I just want to echo, I believe that's a really important part, and we've found that if you are including the folks that are going to be involved in this system and in the data, right from the beginning, so they recognize the importance of the work, they feel like they're a real part of the team, because they are a part of the team, they're going to get more, they're going to have more buy-in too. So I think they start to recognize how important they are in the process, and I know some of our data folks have been the key people to recognize trends that lots of school, folks haven't. Just they have a better mind for the data, and as they start to put it in or pull it out or whatever the case may be, they can really be extremely instrumental. So I agree, and just really stressing how important it is to keep them involved.
One thought about the thing that's at the very top of the screen around who should be on the team. I love the idea of a manager, coach, or champion, someone who's in charge of that. One thing we've also found is that sometimes it's not someone who understands how to up and download the data, and so that might be a separate role.
And again, keeping that person in the loop so they understand why they're doing it, because then then they really have much more buy-in.
Well, and having an understanding of where are there different data collections being done already. I know I've walked in some, even at a relatively small school, and they're like, oh, our teachers are already putting in data for their PBIS, and then they're also putting in data for this, and then they're also putting in data, so they're like triple entering data now on like these individual teachers. And we don't want to overburden people like that. So if you have somebody that actually knows of all of these different systems that are already being funded, we're going to try to take advantage of those, and having that kind of central person with that knowledge is important. Good thoughts on this